One of the major debates in macroeconomics over the years has been this thing called the Phillips Curve. It's named after an economist who noticed a relationship. In essence, he noticed a negative correlation between unemployment rate and the rate of inflation during a given time period. And that's really what the Phillips Curve is, right? It's this economic theory that's kind of focused on the short-run relationship and trade-off between unemployment and inflation. What we want to do here is think through, we want to take a look at a little bit of data on this relationship, and we also want to think through just the macroeconomic theory that leads to this. So let's start with the theory to see if we can understand this a little bit better, and I think the easiest way is to think through it in terms of expansionary policy with the Federal Reserve. So over here, we've kind of looked at these graphs before. We've thought about it with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That way we can use a similar model to think through kind of what's happening here. So let's look at this model over here where the Fed is taking some expansionary measures, and we know that that can be increasing the money supply or kind of targeting a lower interest rate, which we're looking at here with R. So here I'll just mark this as the Fed is taking expansionary policy role. So one of the things they could be doing here is buying bonds on the open market, the Federal Open Market Committee, right? They could be looking at this, which would expand the money supply. It would shift the money supply over here, and we're going to mark that as money supply 2. And what are we looking at on this? Well, on the x-axis, it's the quantity of money that we're actually looking at, currency that would be needed in the economy, and the interest rate as well. And we can see that as a result of this action by the Federal Reserve, this would reduce the interest rate, right? We would go from this interest rate 1 to interest rate 2 down here. So we would see a decrease in the interest rate, and we would also see an increase in the amount of money or currency that's being held. We know that this money demanded is at a given price level. So one of the things we've looked at here is that what would an increase in the monetary supply or in the money supply actually do? Well, this is kind of expansionary in that it should stimulate some extra demand. What does it actually do in the economy? Well, it means that there would be more dollars in the economy, and at every given price level, if you have more dollars, you would be able to consume more, or you would be able to invest more in your business. And so depending on the model that you look at, either would kind of push us out towards an aggregate demand here, which I'm going to mark as aggregate demand 2. That secondary aggregate demand in the short run moves us away from the natural level of output here in the economy, and it would move us here towards this point in the short run. And this short run point is important for 2 reasons, right? The first is that we should see some stimulative effects. We should see kind of a move in output. What is Y here? This is output in real GDP. So we've got, I'll go ahead and mark this right, real GDP or real output in the economy. So we should see an increase in output. But we should also see something else here as well, which is we've talked about before. We would see an increase in the price level, or we would see some inflation. At least that's what the model should indicate, that we should see some short-run inflation as a result. One of the things that's connected to this is this kind of theory of inflation and unemployment here. And what I want to think through is, okay, well, in the short run, what does this look like? So let's go ahead and draw out a kind of third model here. And I'm going to do this in a different color just to separate it out and make sure we're kind of looking at this differently. But in this model, on the x-axis, what we typically look at is unemployment. And I think I'm running out of space here, so unemployment I'll just put down here, right? Unemployment on the x-axis. On the y-axis, what we're looking at is inflation, right? This is the inflation rate. And I'll mark that as the inflation rate. And what we're saying in the Phillips curve is that there's a negative relationship, that there is some sort of negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate, which is another way of saying that, right, as the unemployment rate increases, as unemployment increases, we tend to see decreases in the inflation rate and vice versa. So what would all of this look like over here on kind of this Phillips curve, or what's one way that we would kind of use to think about this? Well, what we typically would think of is that there's what do we know is connected to output here? If output is increasing, right? If real output is increasing, then what should we expect? Well, that means that we are producing more goods, right? Income is increasing in the general economy. If that's the case, then we should expect when output increases, we should expect unemployment should decrease in these cases, right? And that just kind of makes general sense. One, we see this all the time, but two, just when things are going well in the economy, we know that employment improves, unemployment tends to fall. And so what would that look like? Well, that would be this direction here, right? But what are we also seeing in this same type of case? Well, we're seeing a little bit of inflation. We're seeing that this model should say that in the short run, we should see prices increasing as a result of this expansionary policy, or anything that would be kind of doing the same type of thing, either monetarily or fiscally in the same type of direction. In that case, we would be seeing an increase in the inflation rate. And so generally, this Phillips curve kind of comes out of this theory of what's actually happening here with real output and the price level as well. And this would be kind of, what are these 2 points here? Well, we'd be looking at these. They wouldn't match up, right, obviously here with the price level itself, because we're looking at the inflation rate. But this would be kind of like this point here and this point here on the same Phillips curve. And so what is this curve we'd be looking at? Well, we typically think of this as the short run Phillips curve. So this is kind of, we're using this to understand what we think would be the general relationship between unemployment and inflation. There's kind of a last thing that we generally think of when we think of the Phillips curve, which is, sure, there might be a short run Phillips curve, but what about in the long run? What happens in the long run? And we typically think of the long run as being, and I'm going to try to match these up here, we typically think of the long run Phillips curve, I didn't draw that very well, as being a vertical line here. And it's a vertical line in that no matter the inflation rate, there would be some sort of natural level, I'm going to mark it as U, there would be some sort of natural level of unemployment. That thought is very, very nicely connected to this natural level of output in the economy. As we've discussed before, and we've kind of worked through the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to think through why there would be a natural level of output in the economy, and then there would be shocks that would take us away from that potential or that natural level. Well, just in that same way, we can think of the kind of the rate of employment being very similar to that as well. And so there would be some sort of natural level of unemployment connected to that output or income and the general economy overall. And so what do we also know? Well, we know that we're going to return to this long-run aggregate supply curve. We know that we're going to return to this kind of natural level of output. And so whether that's going to happen through a shift in the aggregate demand or a shift in aggregate supply that's going to move us back that direction, what this would tend to indicate is that at that higher price level, as a result of that inflation, we might move a little bit closer back over here, and that in the long run, the rate of inflation doesn't particularly matter on goods. What would matter is that we would always end up tending back towards this natural level of unemployment. I'll say just kind of general numbers that we generally see in the American economy. This natural rate of unemployment is believed to be somewhere between kind of around 5 to 6% unemployment rate. And this inflation rate kind of goes all over the place, but we do know that the inflation target by the Fed is right around 2%. So we can kind of think about some of the things that go into this relationship generally in the kind of macroeconomic terms for the United States. Now that we've thought through the theory and at least thought through what's actually going on here with the Phillips curve itself, next we can just take a look at a little bit of historical data for the United States.